Major themes in biology. In this video lecture, we're going to review the 5 major themes that we see throughout various different topics in biology. So the first one that we're going to look at is the relationship of structure to function. We'll then look at information flow, 2 main processes within ecosystems that allow for energy to transfer within the ecosystem. We'll look at interactions between different levels of biology, and then finally we will look at evolution. So if we first start off looking at structure and function, let's just have a quick definition here. So structure is the shape of something, and function is what it actually does. And in biology, structure and function are very often related. This relation can be seen at many different levels in biology. If we look at an example here, let's look at the lungs and the red blood cells. So we're looking at the level of the organs and the level of actual cells, 2 different levels in biology. And we'll see here that the structure of these components relates to its function, and in particular increases the effectiveness or efficiency of the function. So of course, the function for both the red blood cells and the lungs are to increase the efficiency of gas exchange. So if we look at the lungs here first, we can see that the lungs are made up of all of these different kind of straws or tubes that pass through the lungs and pass into smaller and smaller and smaller tubes or bronchioles. And at the very tips of all of these tubes, you'd have basically these little clusters of grapes. I know this is a bad cluster, but these clusters of grapes, called the alveoli, are where the gas exchange is actually going to occur. So here we can see that there's lots of membranes that are surrounding that alveoli. And the important aspect of that is that the more membrane, the more surface area there is, the more location there is for gas exchange to be able to occur. And when I say gas exchange, I mean for the oxygen to be able to diffuse out of the lungs through these alveolar membranes, and the carbon dioxide to be able to flow back in or diffuse back into the lungs again through these membranes. So the more membranes that there are, the higher surface area there is, the more efficient the lungs will be at gas exchange. If we look over here at the red blood cells, we'll see a similar story. The red blood cells have this disc shape, but they also have a concave aspect to them. Being concave helps to again increase the surface area of those red blood cells. If they were just disc shaped, they wouldn't have as high of a surface area as having this kind of dome-like bend to them as well. Again, the higher the surface area, the more efficient those red blood cells will be at allowing gas exchange to be able to occur. So structure and function are related in biology, and you can see this at multiple different levels throughout the study of biology. Okay, let's move on to our next level, or our next, property. We are looking at information flow. So life can be made of these kind of complex structures that all have to be able to communicate with one another in order for life's functions to be able to occur properly. So if we think back to where we talked about different properties of life, we said that all life has to grow and develop. Well, in order for life to grow and develop, there has to be some kind of genetic instructions or some book of instructions that are going to help tell that organism how to grow and how to develop. So that information has to be stored, it has to be able to be read, received, then passed along to another component of the body that needs the information at that time. As a quick example, if we eat a big supper, we digest that food, and then some of the nutrients like glucose then pass into our bloodstream. So we've got a high blood sugar levels or high glucose, amounts of glucose in our blood, and our body has to regulate those blood sugar levels. So how does it? Well, very, very simply, information about the amount of glucose within the blood is going to be received by the pancreas. The pancreas then is going to use that information and pass the information on to other organs. In particular, the pancreas is going to act on that information by releasing insulin. Insulin is a hormone that's going to then pass through our body, through our bloodstream, and communicate to our liver, communicate to our muscle groups, to tell those different organs to absorb absorb glucose out of the blood and store it within the liver, store it within those muscles, thereby lowering the amount of sugar within the blood. So an easy example of how information is passed from one part of our body to the other. Well, how does our body actually do this? Let's look at a quick analogy here. If I were to write down this message, you read that message and you know, okay, it's saying stand up. All right, now sit down. Clap, clap, clap. I'm sure if people are watching you right now, your family around, or if you're in res or something, people are wondering what's going on if you're actually following these commands. But these are instructions. These are telling you what to do, and I'm using our language to be able to do it. Our language here is English, and we know that English, we have our alphabet that has 26 letters. We arrange those letters into words, and those words mean something to us and tell us what to do. That's our kind of instructions, or the way that we hand on instructions. Inside of our bodies, they also have an alphabet, but the alphabet inside of our bodies are made up of only 4 letters, A, C, T, and G. And similar to the way we arrange our letters, our 26 letters in the alphabet, into different words, our bodies are able to organize these 4 different letters into different sequences to be able to create basically words. But these words, when we're looking at these chemical letters, are called genes. So these letters are arranged into hundreds or even thousands of letters long, and that creates genes. As an example, we were talking about insulin. Well, insulin is a protein, and the way that our body knows how to make insulin is by reading these letters, these 4 different letters in a gene, and the gene for insulin is close to 1,500 letters long. So you read the sequence, A, C, T, G, A, whatever the sequence is, 1,500 letters later, then you have the instructions to be able to create insulin. So same thing, we've got letters that are important, rearranged in different ways to be able to allow commands to be able to occur. All right, so this slide here just explains what I was just talking about. We've got 4 different letters inside of our bodies that are going to communicate these letters in terms of genes. And that's what's going to be able to tell our body what to do. As an example here, again, we said that proteins are what's going to actually be made when we read the genes. So we said insulin is a protein. We have that gene that's 1,500 letters long that says create insulin, and then insulin will pass through our body and communicate to our liver and our muscles saying absorb glucose out of the blood sugar or out of the blood in order to control our blood sugar levels. So that's just one example of a gene. We have thousands of genes, thousands of proteins within our bodies, and altogether our genome is all of those kind of genetic instructions within our body. For a human, our genome is over 3 billion letters long, 3 billion of these chemical letters called nucleotides. That's a lot of instructions. Our genome is saying we've got 3 billion of these letters just in one individual cell to tell that one cell what it's supposed to be able to do. Well then, when you think of the fact that we have over 37 trillion cells and each one of those have 3 billion nucleotides, well that's a lot of DNA. That's a lot of instructions. And again, those instructions are just to be able to control our body's processes, to make sure our body knows what to do and when to do it. So that information has to flow from the genes, from those genetic instructions, to be able to create proteins, and it's the proteins that actually control those body processes. All right, our next theme in biology is energy transformations. Now, this ties back to, again, one of those properties of life. We said that all forms of life need to have energy in order to be able to perform life's functions. So, not all forms of life get energy in the same way. Some organisms like us are going to eat food to get energy. Others will absorb energy from the environment around them. Others yet will do photosynthesis and get energy from the sun. But regardless, all forms of life need energy in order to perform life's functions. Anything like movement, growth, reproduction, any cellular activities are all forms of work which require energy to be able to occur. So where does all of this energy come from? Well, for most ecosystems, this energy ultimately comes from the sun. The energy from the sun in terms of sunlight has to be captured by producers through photosynthesis. So any photosynthetic organism is a producer that are able to capture that sunlight and store the energy in the chemical bonds of sugars. Well, then that energy passes through the food chain as consumers then eat those producers. They eat those producers, eat those sugars, digest them to be able to break those chemical bonds apart and release the energy to that consumer. That consumer can then use that energy for any of its life's functions, and then using that energy converts it to heat, which is then lost from the ecosystem. So this is a very important aspect for the flow of energy. Energy flows through an ecosystem because you constantly need a new supply of energy. Producers will capture the energy, consumers will then eat those producers to get the energy, use the energy, and that energy is lost. Well, let's look at the next kind of process that's involved with these energy transformations. So we talked about the energy aspect. Well, when consumers eat those producers, they're going to break down those sugars to be able to capture the energy, but there's also other things like carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen within those sugars. So what happens to everything else other than the energy? Well, we know that all of that is called matter. And although energy flows through ecosystems, you constantly need a new supply of it, matter is always recycled within ecosystems. It's going to get reused over and over again. So if you look at this diagram here, this helps to explain those two major processes, the flow of energy and that chemical cycling of the matter being used over and over again. So if you first look here, you've got the inflow of light energy, and I would highly advise that everybody just kind of draw in a little tree here, because I don't like the way that that arrow comes straight to that animal, straight to the consumer, because we know first that that sunlight has to get absorbed by producers through photosynthesis. So it can be through the grass here, it can be through this tree, but ultimately that energy is captured in photosynthesis, stored in the chemical bonds of the sugars. But then the energy is passed to consumers as consumers eat those producers. They're going to break down those sugars, break those chemical bonds, releasing the energy so that they can use that energy, and then that energy is lost out of the ecosystem, released as heat. Okay, let's look at the matter, the rest of the kind of ingredients within the sugars. Well, we said that this is a cycle, so we can start anywhere, but we'll just start with the nutrients or these chemical components being within the soil. And this varies from one nutrient cycle to another, but we'll start with the nutrients in the soil, and the producers are able to absorb those nutrients through their roots. They then build those nutrients into their own bodies for the grass to be able to grow or for the trees to be able to grow. And then again, you have this food chain occurring where the consumers are going to eat those producers, thereby handing those chemical components from the producers into the consumers. The consumers are then going to build those chemical components into their own body in order to continue to grow. Anything that's waste products, they're going to release in their feces, and those feces ultimately get broken back down, nutrients recycled back into the soil, where the cycle will continue. Ultimately, all forms of life, that organism is eventually going to die. When it dies, its carcass will get broken down, decomposed, again returning those nutrients back to the soil, and that chemical cycle will then continue. So 2 important processes in terms of energy transformations. You have that flow of energy through the ecosystem, and you have that cycling of nutrients within the ecosystem. All right, let's look at the 4th theme in biology, and that 4th theme is interactions within biological systems. So we know that life has many different scales. So you can study life from the largest scale of the entire biosphere, which is all of the environments on Earth that support life, or you can study biology from the little minuscule microscopic scale, looking just at molecules and atoms, or looking at cells that make up organisms. And you can see at all of those different levels of life, there's going to be interactions between those different levels. So let's take a look at this diagram here. This diagram is showing the major levels of life. So if we start first, the largest, most encompassing level of life is the biosphere. Earth's biosphere includes all of the environments on Earth that support life. It's made up of this next level, ecosystems. So the biosphere is made up of multiple interconnected ecosystems. An ecosystem consists of all of the living organisms in a particular area, as well as all of the non-living physical components of the environment that affect those organisms living there. So if we look at the example in this diagram here, we can see that we're looking at an ecosystem of a tide pool, and this is in particular in the Galapagos Islands. And the ecosystem would be made up of the iguanas, the crabs, the algae, the bacteria, all of the different living organisms within that location, as well as all of the non-living physical components like the rocks, the air, the sunlight. Those are all going to affect the organisms in some way. So those organisms are going to interact with that non-living environment within the ecosystem. Well, if you go down one further level there, you've got communities. Communities are all of the living organisms in an ecosystem. They're all collectively referred to as the community. So in this example here, the community would be all of the iguanas, the crabs, the algae, the bacteria, even those little microscopic forms of life that you don't see are all part of that community. A community is made up of, step 4 there, multiple populations. A population is a group of interacting individuals, but of just one species. So you'd have the population of iguanas, or you'd have the population of crabs. Those populations are made up of organisms. So one individual iguana would be an example of one individual organism. But even at this stage, you can start to go down further into smaller levels of life. So organisms are made up of organ systems that have 2 or more organs that are interacting with one another in order to complete a particular function. We can see with this example here, the circulatory system inside of the iguana made up of the heart as well as the blood vessels that are going to circulate blood throughout the body. Well, then those organs are just made up of tissues. Those tissues are interconnected cells that are all going to work together for a common function. So within animals, some examples of tissues are our connective tissues, our muscle tissues, nervous tissues, and our epithelial tissues. The example shown here is the muscle tissue in particular of the heart, so it's the cardiac muscle tissue. So tissues are made up of cells. So you're going to have these cardiac cells that work together to be able to create that cardiac tissue. And a cell is actually the smallest unit of life that can still display all of those 8 major properties of life. You can, though, still zoom in down a little further into organelles. The organelles are components within the cells that have a particular function. So, for example, here you have the nucleus as one organelle, and its function is going to be to house the DNA. When you go down to the level of organelles, you don't see all of those properties of life. You have to stay at the level of cells to be able to see all of those properties. But there's still lots to learn from that level of organelles. So we said we've got the nucleus, you've got things like the endoplasmic reticulum, the mitochondria or chloroplasts. There's all kinds of different organelles that you'll learn about in Chapter 4 that all have particular functions that need to occur in order for that cell to perform its proper functions. Again, if you go down a step further, you now enter the chemical level in this hierarchy. And the chemical level consists of molecules, and molecules are just interconnected atoms that are interacting with one another. So atoms, we know, are that smallest unit of matter, and those atoms are going to interact with one another on that chemical level in order to produce molecules. Here, the example shown is a molecule of DNA, which we've already talked about is crucial for life because DNA is how you make up those genes. DNA are those chemical letters, those instructions that you need for life to be able to occur. All right, so these are all of the different levels of life. How does that apply to or relate to interactions? Well, you're going to have interactions at all of these different levels of life. If you look up here, you can see that you would have interactions at the community level where you have, those iguanas eating the algae as an example. So you'd see a lot of kind of predator-prey relationships at the community level. When you go into the population level, you'll see kind of lots of fighting for resources amongst the iguanas as an example. You can see how at the organ system and organ level, you'd have to have organs that are working together in order to complete their task. So again, at every level, you're going to have interactions that are occurring that are affecting life in some way. Well, an important aspect to talk about then is emergent properties. Emergent properties are showing new properties that only emerge as complexity increases. So what I mean by that is if you look at individual heart cells, those individual heart cells are not able to pump blood. One individual cell cannot pump blood through your body. Those heart cells have to connect together into tissues, which have to connect together into that heart, and it's the heart itself that's able to actually physically pump in order to pump that blood and circulate it around the body. So the ability to pump blood would be an emergent property. You don't see it at the individual cell level, but you do see it at the organ level where you've got some higher complexity. All right, that brings us to our fifth and final theme in biology called evolution. Evolution is a very important topic in biology and is very important because it explains both the unity and diversity in life. The unity and diversity. Well, what does that actually mean? Well, we know if we picture, let's say, a tree, a mushroom, and a human, we can see how diverse those three organisms are. A tree, a mushroom, a human, none of them look anything alike. They all get food in different ways. They all reproduce in different ways. But if you zoom down at the cellular level, we all have common cellular processes. We all have DNA, that's our genetic instructions. So when you zoom way in, even a mushroom, a tree, and a human that appear so diverse, they actually are very similar. So you can see unity at those smaller levels of life. So evolution is the scientific way to explain why we see such diversity as well as such unity in life. So evolution is saying that each current species is a twig on this branching tree of life that extends back to a first common ancestor. So if we look at this generic kind of tree of life here, we can see that the common ancestor is the base of this tree. And evolution is saying that we all evolved from this one common ancestor, and over time, this common ancestor, as it changed, it developed into new organisms and new groups of life over time. You can see that portrayed by these new branches off of the tree of life. So on this tree, you can see some important groups of life, bacteria. You can see our plants, our group of plants, fungi, and animals, all of which are very diverse, but all of which ultimately came from this base of the tree, came from this common ancestor. Because we all evolved from this common ancestor, we have a lot of similarities. We have that same cellular structure and that same genetic material. Well, how does this process of evolution actually happen? Charles Darwin came up with the idea that evolution happens through natural selection. So in 1859, he wrote this book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And in the book, he outlined kind of two main points. The first point was that he saw descent with modification. And what that means is that species today descended from ancestral species. And you can see this, or you can kind of start to come to this conclusion by looking at things like fossils and looking at the similarities of species today to fossils or skeletons of things that lived in the past. The other main point within his book is that natural selection is the reason for why you see this descent with modification. So that's how evolution actually happens. Well, let's look at this quick analogy here to see if that makes sense. So here we have this environment with these white dots are my bugs that are living on this leaf. And these bugs are white bugs on a green leaf. If a bird flew by and wanted to have a snack, well, these bugs are very obvious. A bird could come and eat those bugs up, no problem, because they're very visible. Well, let's say that you have these bugs reproduce, and as they reproduce, you have a mutation that occurs. And that mutation leads to this green bug. Well, now, when the bird flies by, again, it's going to eat those bugs that it sees. It's a lot harder to see that green bug, and as a result, that green bug survives, and that green bug reproduces. As long as that trait of being green is heritable, as long as it can be passed down onto his offspring, well then when that green bug reproduces, it has more green offspring. Now again, bird flies by, still eats more of those white bugs because those are the visible ones, and you're left again with more green bugs that are being born. Ultimately, over time, that entire population of white bug eventually turns into this population of green bug. It's still the same type of bug, but you had this one mutation that caused this green color to appear in one individual. That individual, because it was more suited to the environment, it was more camouflaged in this case, it survived longer than the white bugs, it reproduced more, and eventually you have this green color increasing in the environment. So let's look back and kind of tie that into what Darwin was talking about with natural selection. So first we've got this big kind of definition here for natural selection, but natural selection says that in the struggle for existence, so there's always struggles in life. There's struggles for resources, like you need food, you need water, you need some habitat in order to live within. So life is a struggle, and in that struggle, those individuals with heritable traits that are best suited to the environment are more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce, leaving a higher amount of offspring. So again, those traits have to be heritable, meaning that they can be passed down to their offspring. If they aren't heritable, then it's just going to end. That green color would just end at that generation. But if the mutation happens and in the DNA and is able to pass down to the next generation, then that green trait will persist in that population and eventually increase over time. Those organisms that are most suited to the environment leave the greatest number of healthy offspring. So this idea means that there's an unequal reproductive success. Those individuals that aren't as suited to the environment, like those white bugs, they are going to get eaten or have a higher chance of getting eaten by the birds and not reproducing. So there's a difference in the number of offspring that the white bugs are going to have as compared to the higher number of offspring that the green bugs will leave, because they're able to camouflage into that green environment of the leaf and hide from those predators. Okay, so a couple of kind of caveats here is natural selection does not encourage changes, meaning natural selection, there's no kind of end sight in mind saying, I think, these bugs would look better as green, so I'm going to cause this green mutation to occur. It's not causing these changes. It's just editing changes that happen by mistake. Mutations happen. They're mistakes that happened. And in some cases, those mistakes are advantageous to the organisms that it happens to. So in the case of the bugs, the mutation occurred, changed the color from white to green. So the offspring that was born was green rather than white. And that was an advantage to that offspring. As long as it's a heritable trait, then the green bug will then have more green offspring, and that will change or modify that species over time. So you can see that descent with modification. A real life example is looking at ground finches, and ground finches are a species of bird. Well, there's many species within it, but this diagram here, or this picture here, is showing a species of finches in the Galapagos Islands that primarily like to eat these these small seeds. Now, you can see in this picture here, these are all the same species, but you have various different sizes of beaks. Look how large this beak is in comparison to how small this beak is. Now, those beak sizes change over generations, and it changes depending on what seeds are available. So scientists looked at the beak size of these finches over a couple of decades, and what they found was that in dry years, those kind of small preferred seeds, they were in short supply. So those birds that had small beaks weren't really able to eat because they didn't have a lot of small seeds. There were more larger seeds, more resilient seeds, but those birds with the small beaks couldn't break into those larger seeds in order to get the food that they need to survive. Those finches that had a larger beak size, they were able to break into those larger seeds. They were able to get the nutrition. they were able to have the energy to be able to produce offspring. Those finches with the smaller beaks, either they died before the age of reproduction, or they didn't have energy to have as many eggs as those finches that had eaten lots of large seeds and could have a larger number of eggs, a larger number of offspring. So again, you have this unequal reproductive success where, depending on their beak size, it allows them to have a certain amount of energy to then have a certain amount of offspring. So that was in dry years, but then in wet years, what scientists found was the complete opposite. You would see these fluctuations in the kind of average beak size of the finches over time, where in wet years, the small seeds were more abundant. There were lots more small seeds around everywhere than there were these large seeds. And these smaller beaks were more efficient for eating those small, plentiful seeds. So as a result, they had the beaks with the smaller, or the birds, with the smaller beaks had more energy because they were getting more food. So those birds with the smaller beaks had a higher reproductive success. They had more offspring than those finches that had the larger beaks that were inefficient at being able to eat those small seeds. So you can see over time these changes in the beak sizes depending on the environment, depending on, in this case, the size of the seeds available. Here we can see another very relevant example of natural selection, and this is showing the evolution of bacteria to be able to resist antibiotics. So it's showing, in particular, cattle in the farming industry. Cattle are often fed antibiotics within their food, and the goal is to try to prevent bacteria from growing that can harm the cattle. But by doing that, it actually allows those bacteria to evolve resistance to those antibiotics over time. So let's look through this example. So here we can see this population of bacteria living inside the cattle, and this red one is identified as one that has that resistance to the antibiotic. So it had a mutation in its gene, and it allows it to be able to survive when antibiotics are in the location. So in this diagram here, you can see the cattle are fed the antibiotics, and the antibiotics kill off the majority of the bacteria, but this red one is resistant to it. It's not going to die off. Well, then in the next generation, you're going to have more of those red bacteria because they didn't die. As you continue to provide antibiotics to that cattle in its feed, well, it's going to continue to kill off those non-resistant bacteria portrayed by the yellow, and the ones that are going to survive and reproduce are those that are resistant to the antibiotics. So by constantly giving antibiotics, well, it's constantly pushing, constantly causing this natural selection to occur, because you have this descent with modification. You have the bacterium that are reproducing, so those would be the descendants, but they're modified. In this case here, they're modified in the fact that they're resistant to that antibiotic, and then they won't get killed off. So again, that's a huge issue in today's society, overusing antibiotics, which is causing the bacteria to evolve, and as a result, now we have many bacteria that are resistant to the antibiotics. So if the cattle or if a human gets a particular illness because of the bacteria, sometimes now we aren't actually able to cure that illness because we can't fight those bacteria with antibiotics. All right, so that concludes our video looking at those 5 major themes in biology. Those 5 major themes, again, being 1, the relationship of structure to function, so how structure and function are related in biology. 2, how information flows from DNA or our genes to be able to control our growth and development. 3, how there's 2 major processes within ecosystems. 1, the flow of energy from the sun, then released as heat. and the cycling of nutrients within that ecosystem. 4, how you see how there's many different levels of structure within biology and how you see interactions at each of those different levels. And finally, 5, evolution, and in particular, how evolution happens through natural selection. So I hope you have a better understanding of these 5 major themes in biology.